They laughed at her the first day she rode into Coldwater, and they laughed at her the last. But somewhere in between, a man none of us expected to speak finally did. And after that, nothing in this town sat the same way again. I wrote most of it down because I knew if I didn't, the version that survived would be the wrong one. This is the true one, or as true as an old man's pencil can keep it. The mule went down in the middle of Front Street, and that, more than anything, is where I'd say it began. It was August, the kind of August where the heat lays on your shoulders like a wet saddle blanket and won't be shrugged off, and I was sitting under the awning of Prute's store with my tally book open on my knee, pretending to count what we owed the freighter and really just watching the street do its slow boil. I keep a tally book on me always. Have for 40 years. My wife, before she passed, used to say I'd write down my own dying breath and underline it twice. She wasn't wrong. A man my age forgets faces, forgets names, forgets which calf belongs to which cow, but a thing written down stays put. So I write. I licked the pencil. I waited for the street to give me something worth the lead. It gave me her. She came in from the South Road on a flatbed wagon with a busted axle housing she'd lashed together with rawhide and prayer, 2 mules in the traces, and one of them, the off mule, a gray with a Roman nose and a temper, deciding right there in front of the whole town that it had walked far enough in this life. Its legs just folded. Down it went in a cloud of dust and a clatter of harness, and the wagon lurched, and the woman driving it stood straight up off the seat with the reins still wound around her fists, and she did not scream. That was the first thing I noted. She did not scream. A man would have cussed. Most women I've known would have at least let out a sound. She just stood there in the rocking wagon with her boots planted and her jaw set, and she looked down at that mule the way you'd look at a debt you'd already half expected to come due. The street, of course, loved it. Coldwater in those days had maybe 300 souls, and most of them seemed to be on Front Street that afternoon, and they came to the edges of the boardwalk the way folks do, drawn to another body's misfortune like flies to a cut. Somebody laughed first. I never knew who. It moved through the crowd the way a grass fire moves, low and quick and finding fuel everywhere. By the time she'd climbed down off that wagon, hiked her skirts up over the tops of her boots without a lick of shame, and gone to her knees in the dirt beside the fallen mule, half of Coldwater was grinning and the other half was pretending not to. "Lady," Del Sutter called out from in front of the saloon, and Del was the sort who'd been waiting his whole life for a reason to raise his voice. "You bring that thing all the way here just to bury it in the road." A few men laughed at that. Del straightened up, pleased with himself. She didn't look up at him. She had her hands on the mule's neck, low, feeling along the windpipe, and she leaned down close to its eye and said something I couldn't hear. The mule's ear flicked. Its sides were heaving like a bellows, and she stayed down there in the dirt with the whole town watching and laughing, talking to a dying mule in the middle of Front Street, and she did not once look up to see who was laughing. I want to be honest about myself here, because if I'm not, the rest of this isn't worth the paper. I didn't help her. I sat under the awning with my tally book and I watched, same as everyone. I told myself it wasn't my mule and it wasn't my business, and a man my age has got no call going down on his knees in the road. All true. All cowardice with a clean coat on. I've come to think that's most of what cowardice is, a true reason held up in front of the ugly one. She got the mule up. That's the part I want set down plain, because nobody who tells this story in the saloon ever includes it. She got it up. She unhooked the off mule from the traces, every buckle, working fast and sure with her sleeves rolled, and the sweat cutting tracks through the dust on her face, and she dragged the harness clear so the animal had room. Then she got it on its feet, not by hauling on it, which is what a fool does, but by getting behind it, getting it rocking, talking the whole while in that low, steady voice, until the mule heaved itself up out of the dirt on legs that shook like a newborn calf's. The crowd had quieted some by then. There's a particular silence a crowd makes when the thing they came to laugh at refuses to be funny. She led the gray to the trough in front of Prute's, let it drink, and she stood with her hand flat on its neck the whole time, and only then, did she look up and find the town looking back at her. I'll tell you what was in her face, and you can believe me or not. It wasn't anger. I'd have understood anger. It was a kind of weariness so old and so deep that it had stopped being weariness and become something more like stone. She looked at us the way the desert looks at you, patient, unimpressed, sure of outlasting you. "Ma'am," I said, because I could not stand it any more, and I hauled myself up out of the chair and crossed the boards. My knees announced every year of me. "There's a livery 2 streets over, Olson's. He'll have liniment and a stall, and he won't charge a widow more'n he charges anyone, which is to say he'll charge you double, and you can argue him down to fair." She studied me. Her eyes were a pale gray, near colorless, the kind of eyes that come down through families that have looked into too much sun for too many generations. There was a scar through one eyebrow, thin and old and white. She was younger than I'd guessed from across the street, 30 maybe, though the work and the weather had put more on her than 30 years alone would account for. "And what's it cost me," she said, "to take advice from you?" "Not a thing. I'm too old to want anything off anybody," which was a lie, but a friendly one. She looked at me a beat longer. Then she nodded, just once, and clucked to the mule, and led it off down the street toward Olson's, the other mule and the broke-down wagon left standing where they were. She didn't ask anybody to mind them. She just trusted that the same town that had laughed at her wasn't low enough to rob a stranded wagon in broad daylight. She was wrong about that, as it turned out, but that comes later. Her name was Cora Halloway, and I got it the way you get most things in a town that size, in pieces, from the wrong people, with the meat of it left out. She'd come to prove up a claim. That much I learned by the second day, from Prude himself, who'd had to enter her into the ledger when she bought flour and coffee and a 50-pound sack of nails. Her husband had filed on a half-section out east of town, out past the Mestino Wash where the land goes from bad to worse, and her husband was dead, fever, the winter before, somewhere on the road out, and under the law she had the right to finish what he'd started. 5 years living on it, working it, putting up a house and turning the ground, and at the end of 5 years it was hers free and clear. That was the deal the government made with anyone fool enough or desperate enough to take it. A man trying to prove up that ground alone would have had the town's grudging respect. Hard, they'd have said, but a man's got the right. A woman trying it had something else entirely, and Coldwater handed it to her free of charge. "She'll be back through here inside a month," Del Sutter said, holding court at the saloon, and I was there because the saloon is where the talk is, and the talk is where I do half my listening. Begging a ride east on somebody's freight wagon. You watch. That ground out by the wash killed 2 men I know of. It ain't gonna lay down for a woman with a busted mule and no sense to know when she's beat. 2 men you know of, I said. Funny, I only ever heard of the one, the Mexican fella. What was it? There was 2, Del said, and glared, and that was the end of my contribution. I'll grant Del this much. The ground was bad. I'd ridden it. Out past the Mestino the soil goes thin and the rock comes up through it like bone through a starved animal, and the only water for a hard mile is the wash itself, which runs 3 weeks of the year and is a dry ditch the other 49. Whatever Halloway had filed on, he'd filed on it desperate or blind. A man would look at that country and think, nothing wants to live here. A man would be wrong, but it would take him a while to learn it. What the town didn't say out loud at first was the other thing. The Mestino country wasn't empty. The army said it was. The army said the whole district had been cleared and pacified, and the Apache rounded up and marched off to the reservation up north, and the men of Coldwater repeated it to each other the way men repeat a thing they need to be true. But anybody who'd ridden out there knew different. There were still bands in that country, small ones, families more than war parties, folks who'd slipped the net or come back off the reservation because the reservation was a slow way to die and the old country, however hard, was theirs. They kept to the high broken ground. They took a beef now and again, the way you'd take rent. They didn't trouble much, and they weren't much troubled because the men of Coldwater were brave enough in the saloon and careful enough out of it. Cora Halloway's claim sat square in the middle of that country. And here is the thing that turned the town's laughter into something with teeth in it. By the end of her first week, somebody had ridden out past the wash and come back with a story. Said he'd seen her out at the claim and she hadn't been alone. Said there'd been Apache at her place, 2, 3 of them, sitting their horses easy at the edge of her dooryard like they'd been asked. Said she'd walked right out to them. Said she'd talked to them. Talked, Dell repeated when the story made its way to the saloon. He let the words sit there. In Apache, like she knew it, like she was raised to it. The saloon went quiet in that particular way. I want to be careful here. I don't know what was true and what was Coldwater making a thing bigger because a bigger thing is more fun to hate. But I know what the town decided, and the town decided fast. A woman alone was a joke. A woman alone who talked Apache and let them ride up to her door without reaching for a gun. That was something a frightened town could turn into whatever it needed. A spy. A squaw, they said, and worse. A woman with no decency in her. The kind that had got herself put out here because no honest place would have her. None of them knew her. That was the thing that ate at me, sitting in the corner with my tally book and my coffee gone cold. Not one of those men had spoken 20 words to Cora Halloway, and they'd built her a whole life out of nothing but their own fear, and then they hated her for the life they'd built. I have seen a town do that to a person more than once in my years. It is the ugliest thing people do, and they do it together, smiling, certain they're decent. I didn't say any of that, mind. I was a 61-year-old ranch foreman with bad knees and no kin left and a job I needed to keep, and the men deciding what to think about Cora Halloway were the same men I sold beef to and drank beside and would need at branding. I told myself my silence was the wisdom of age. I wrote in my tally book that night by the lamp she got the mule up. They forgot the mule already. I have not forgot the mule. It's the closest I came that first week to taking a side, a line in a book no one would read. The man who would change all of it was, at that point, not saying anything either. His name was Cal Renner, and he rode for the Diamond Bar, which neighbored our outfit on the north, and I knew him the way you know any young hand from a neighboring spread, by his horse, by his work, by his reputation, which in Cal's case was thin because he'd built it on purpose to be thin. He was maybe 25, quiet to the point that men who didn't know him took it for slow, and men who did took it for something else and left it alone. He had a way of being in a room without being in it. He'd come to town on Saturdays with the rest of the Diamond Bar crew, and while they got loud, he'd sit at the end of the bar with one beer he never finished, and he'd watch, and he'd leave before the others got mean. I talked to him a handful of times. Fences, strays, weather. He was the kind of man who, if you asked him a question, would think about it long enough that you'd figure he hadn't heard, and then he'd give you back an answer that had more in it than your question deserved. I liked him. I didn't think about him much. He was furniture, the way most folks are, until the day he wasn't. What I didn't know, what nobody in Coldwater knew, because Cal Renner was not a man who handed his history to anyone, was where he'd come from. I'd learn it later in pieces, the way I learn everything. But I'll tell you now so you understand the rest, because the town never did get to understand it, and that was half the tragedy. Cal Renner's mother had been a Mexican woman from down near the border, and his father a white man who'd married her in a country that mostly didn't allow such marriages to mean anything. And Cal had grown up in the in-between place, the place where you're not enough of one thing to be welcomed and too much of it to be left alone. He'd been called names before he could spell them. He'd watched his mother get served last in stores and spat near in the street, and called things by men who tipped their hats to white women an hour later. He had learned, young, the exact mechanism by which a town decides a person is less, and he had spent his whole grown life keeping his head down, and his mouth shut so that the mechanism would never again turn his way. So when Cal Renner watched Coldwater take Cora Halloway and start grinding her up the same way, I think he recognized the machine. I think he'd have known the sound of it anywhere. But that Saturday, the second Saturday, he still hadn't said a word. It happened in front of Prute's, which is fitting, because Prute's is where the town did most of its business of every kind. Cora had come in for supplies. She'd been out at the claim near 2 weeks by then, and the country had started to show on her. She was thinner, and her hands when she set her coin on the counter were cut and scabbed across the knuckles in a way that told me she'd been laying up rock without gloves, building something, a wall or a foundation, working stone with her bare hands because she couldn't afford to wear out gloves she'd need worse later. She bought careful: coffee, beans, a little salt pork, lamp oil. She counted her coins twice. She did not buy one thing she didn't need, and watching her count I understood she was running close to the bone, closer than pride would let her say. Del Sutter and 2 others were on the boardwalk when she came out with her arms full. I was across the street. I heard it the way you hear a thing you've been dreading, a half beat before it comes, your gut already clenching. "There she is," Del said loud for the benefit of the men with him. "Coldwater's own Apache bride. You give my regards to your friends out at the wash, ma'am. They treatin' you kindly." And one of the men with him laughed, and the other said something lower that I didn't catch but that bent Del's grin into something worse, and Del said, still loud, "I hear they're real friendly. I hear they're friendly all night." Now, Cora Halloway had walked through 2 weeks of this town's worst without once giving it the satisfaction of a flinch. She'd taken the laughter and the names and the stories told about her to her face, and she'd kept her chin level and her eyes forward, and she'd never once let them see it land. I had come in 2 weeks to think of her as past hurting. That was my own foolishness. Nobody is past hurting. They just get good at choosing where it shows. She stopped. She didn't put her supplies down. She stood there with her arms full of the beans and the coffee and the lamp oil she'd counted her coins twice for, and she turned her head and looked at Del Sutter, and for just a moment, half a second less, I saw it land. I saw the thing under the stone. Her eyes did something. Her mouth did something. It was gone almost before it came, locked back down behind the weariness, but I'd seen it. And once I'd seen it, I couldn't unsee it. And I understood that every single day in this town cost her something she paid in private and would die before she'd let Del Sutter watch her pay. She didn't answer him. She started down the steps. And Del, who could not abide being given nothing, stepped into her path. "I'm talking to you," he said. That's when Cal Renner crossed the street. I didn't see where he came from. He'd been at the end of the boardwalk, I think, by the saloon with his crew, and the next I knew he was just there between Cora Halloway and Del Sutter, having put himself there without hurry and without a word, the way water gets into a low place. He wasn't a big man. Del had inches and pounds on him. But there's a thing some men carry that has nothing to do with size, a kind of stillness that makes the air around them careful, and Cal Renner had it, and the boardwalk felt it before anybody understood what was happening. "Help her with those," Cal said. It took a second to land that he was talking to Del. "What?" Del said. "Her arms are full." Cal's voice was quiet, even, like he was discussing the weather or fence line. "You're a man with empty hands and she's a woman whose arms are full and you're standing in her way, so help her or move." The boardwalk had gone dead silent. Across the street, I'd stood up out of my chair without deciding to. My tally book was on the boards at my feet, and I never even felt it fall. Del Sutter looked at Cal Renner, and you could see him doing the arithmetic men like Del are always doing. The size of him, the want of him, the cost of him. And you could see him not like the answer, and you could see him reach for the thing men like Del always reach for when the arithmetic comes out wrong. "Well," Del said, slow, and his eyes moved over Cal in a way I knew, a way I'd seen 100 times. "Now, I'd heard the Diamond Bar took on a greaser this spring. Didn't put it together till just now. You and her, you'd make a reel." He didn't finish. "I'll tell you what Cal Renner did, and I'll tell you it took me a long time to understand it, and longer to forgive my own part in not understanding it sooner." He didn't hit Del. He didn't reach for the pistol he wasn't even wearing. He took one step forward, just one, close enough that Dell had to look up at the distance and feel how little of it there was, and he said something to Del Sutter so low that no one but the two of them ever heard it. I watched Dell's face while he heard it. I watched the color go out of it. I watched a man who had spent 2 weeks finding things to be cruel about discover, all at once, that he had run out of road. Then Cal stepped back. He bent down, slow, deliberate, never taking his eyes off Dell, and he picked up the sack of beans that Cora had let slip from her arms when she'd stopped, and which none of us had even noticed fall. He brushed the dust off it with the flat of his hand, and he held it out to her. Cora Halloway looked at the bag of beans in this stranger's hands. For 2 weeks she had been laughed at, lied about, named, and not once helped, and she had borne all of it without breaking, and it was this, a man holding out a bag of beans, that very nearly undid her right there on the boardwalk in front of the whole town. I saw her throat move. I saw her blink hard once. And I understood that there is a particular cruelty in the world's first kindness, after a long enough drought of it, that it can split a person open in a way that no amount of meanness ever could. She took the beans. "Thank you," she said. Her voice came out steadier than her eyes. Cal Renner touched the brim of his hat. He didn't smile. He just looked at her a moment, that long, considering look of his, like she was a question he was taking the proper time to answer. Then he stepped aside, out of her way, which was more than Del Sutter had managed, and Cora Halloway walked down the steps and across the street to where her wagon waited, and she loaded her supplies, and she climbed up onto the seat, and she drove south out of Coldwater toward the bad country and her half-built house of stone, and she did not look back. I picked my tally book up off the boards. My hands weren't quite steady. I licked the pencil. I wrote one line, and I'm looking at it now in the old book, the ink gone brown with the years. A man held out a bag of beans today, and I believe the whole town changed and does not yet know it. I was right about that. I just didn't yet know what it would cost the man who did it. If you came expecting that the bag of beans fixed it, that the town saw the wrong of itself and softened, the way they do in the cheap stories, then I'm sorry, and I'll ask you to stay anyhow. Because what a town like Coldwater does when it gets shamed is not get better. It gets meaner, and it gets quieter about it, and it waits. I have lived long enough to know that the most dangerous thing in this world is a small place that has been made to feel small. The beans didn't end anything. The beans started the part that hurt. What Cal Renner whispered to Del Sutter on the boardwalk, I never learned. I asked him once much later on a night when men sometimes tell each other things, and he looked into the fire a while and then he said, I told him I knew what he was afraid of, and I told him I'd seen men braver than him die of it anyway. Then he wouldn't say more, and I didn't press, because there are things a man earns the right to keep. But I learned what it cost him, and the cost started inside the week. Del Sutter was not a man who could carry a public unmanning quietly. He was the kind that, having been made small, had to find a way to make the world smaller still, so that he could feel large again by comparison. He couldn't go at Cal directly. Cal had seen to that, with whatever he'd said, and so Del did the cowardly arithmetic again and arrived at the cowardly answer. He went at the thing Cal had defended. He started talking, not loud the way he had before, low now to the right men. He'd lean in at the bar and say it like he was reluctant to, like it pained him to be the one who knew. You hear the Diamond Bar greasers been riding out to the Halloway place, past the wash, where decent men don't go. You think about what kind of man rides out to a woman like that. You think about what they're cooking up out there, the two of them, with the Apache thick as fleas in that country. You think about it. And men did think about it, because Del gave them a shape for a fear they already carried. And a fear with a shape is a comfort even when the shape is a lie. Here is what was true. Cal Renner did ride out to the Halloway place. I know because I followed him, the second time he went, on a sorry excuse about checking the north fence, which fence did not need checking and which Cal surely knew didn't. I am not proud of the following. But I'd taken a kind of interest by then that I couldn't talk myself out of, an old man's interest in seeing one decent thing land somewhere before he's done. And so I rode out a half-mile back of Cal Renner, and I watched what he did when he got there. What he did was work. Cora Halloway had been laying up a wall, the stone wall I'd seen tearing her hands to ribbons, the foundation of a house she meant to raise alone before the law's clock ran out on her. It was slow, brutal labor, finding the stone, hauling it, fitting it, a woman moving rock that would have staggered 2 men. She'd got it maybe knee-high in 2 weeks. At that rate, the 5-year clock would beat her by years. Cal Renner rode in, and she came out with a rifle, because by then she trusted no one who came up that road and who could fault her. And Cal sat his horse at the edge of the dooryard with his hands where she could see them, and they talked, too far for me to hear, a long while. Then he got down, and he took off his good shirt and folded it over his saddle, and he picked up a stone, and he set it on her wall. They worked till dark. I watched 2 people who owed each other nothing build a wall in the killing heat, not talking much, just working, passing stone to stone, finding the rhythm that 2 bodies find when they're set on the same task and have stopped needing words for it. And I understood that Cal Renner wasn't courting her, not the way Dell's filth had it. It was something both simpler and harder to name. He'd seen the machine come for her. He'd been ground by that machine himself. And he had decided, in his quiet way, that he was not going to stand on a boardwalk and watch it happen to another soul if his 2 hands could put 1 stone between her and it. I rode home in the dark with my chest tight in a way I didn't have a name for. I wrote in the tally book, 2 outcasts, 1 wall. The town will not abide it. God help them, the town will not abide a kindness it can't take part in. I made myself useful after that. It's the only way I know to apologize for 2 weeks of doing nothing. You don't say sorry, you just start doing. I couldn't be seen helping her. My outfit sold beef to half of Coldwater, and Dell Sutter's brother held the note on a pasture we leased, and an old man's righteousness has to be cut to fit his purse, which is its own small shame I'll own. But there are quiet ways. I had a wagon going past the wash with cull lumber that was bound to be burned anyway, and it happened to throw a load near her gate, and I happened not to come back for it. I had a sack of seed corn that had gone to Weevil by my own report and was perfectly sound, and it found its way south. I sent these things the way a coward sends help, with deniability built in, and I won't pretend it was bravery. But it was something, and after 2 weeks of nothing, something felt like a debt being paid down a coin at a time. Cora never knew it was me. Cal, I think, suspected. He never said. We had an understanding, Cal and I. The kind 2 men build out of glances across a saloon and a few words about fence. He knew I was on the right side of it, even if I was too far back from the front to be much use. Through Cal, over the weeks, I learned her. Not all at once. Cal gave up information about as freely as a bank gives up money, but in pieces, sitting outside the bunkhouse some evenings when our crews crossed. She'd been raised on a mission down south, it turned out. Her father a preacher, hard as the country, who died of his own hardness when she was young. The mission took in Apache children the army had taken from their families, educated them, which meant beat the language and the gods and the names out of them and called it salvation. And Cora, a white preacher's daughter, had grown up among those children, played with them, learned their tongue from them in secret, the way children pass forbidden things hand to hand, while her father preached that the same tongue was the devil's. She'd watched what the mission did to those children. She'd watched some of them die of it, of grief more than anything, the particular sickness of a child cut off from everything that made it itself. So when Cora Halloway looked at the Apache families slipping through the Mestino country, folks who'd run from exactly the kind of salvation she'd watched kill her playmates, she did not see what Coldwater saw. She saw people she had grown up loving, doing the only sane thing, which was refusing to die quiet. And when 2 of them rode up to her dooryard that first week, hungry, with a sick child, she had not reached for a gun. She had spoken to them in a tongue she'd carried like a stone in her chest for 20 years, and she had given them what little she had. That was the whole crime. That was the thing Del Sutter turned into, friendly all night. A woman fed a hungry child and spoke kindly to its mother in a language the town would have beaten out of her if it could. "Why'd she tell you all this?" I asked Cal once. He thought about it the long way he thought about everything. "Didn't mostly," he said. "I told her about my mother first. And that was all, but it was everything. Two people who'd each carried a thing alone too long, finally setting it down in front of someone who wouldn't make them ashamed of it. I have come to believe that's the rarest thing two people can give each other, and the most dangerous in a place that has decided they're not allowed to have it." The drought broke the slow part of it. That country runs on the Mestino Wash, and the wash runs on summer storms, and that summer the storms didn't come. By September the grass was gone to dust, and the cattle were drifting, and ranchers all up and down the district were getting that pinched, calculating look that hard men get when the weather starts deciding who lives. A frightened town gets cruel. A thirsty town goes looking for someone to blame the sky on. There's no reason in it. There never is. But a place will find a face to hang its disaster on, and Coldwater had been keeping a face ready for weeks. It started with cattle. A few head of Diamond Bar stock went missing out near the wash, drifted, most likely, or down in a draw dead of thirst, the way stock dies in a drought. But Del Sutter knew an opportunity the way a buzzard knows a smell. "Apache," he said, "driving off our beef while we starve. And who's out there feeding them, telling them where the cattle drift him? Who's out there cozy with them while honest men go broke?" He didn't have to say her name. He'd said it so many times it was already in the air. I watched the thing build over a week, and I could not stop it. And I want to set down honestly the particular helplessness of watching a town talk itself toward something terrible. It's like watching water find a crack in a dam. Every man alone is reasonable, will tell you he means no harm, wants only what's fair. But the men together become a different animal than the men apart. And the animal has no reason in it and cannot be talked to. And it grows. And one night it stops talking and stands up and goes. They went on a Thursday. I know because I was in the saloon when the talk turned from talk to plan, and I'll carry to my grave the look of those faces in the lamplight. Men I'd branded cattle beside, ordinary men, fathers and churchgoers, with the animal up behind their eyes, riding out to have a word with the Halloway woman. To look into the missing stock. To put a scare into her was how the kindest of them put it, so she'd take the hint and clear out and stop bringing the Apache down on decent folks. A dozen men, drink in them, the drought in them, Del Sutter at the head of it, finally large again. I did the only thing an old coward with bad knees could do that was worth a damn. I slipped out the back of the saloon, and I got my horse, and I rode for the Diamond Bar to find Cal Renner. Because there was one man in that district who would stand between Cora Halloway and what was coming, and I knew it, and I think part of me had known it since the bag of beans, that this would all come down to whether Cal Renner was willing to stand in the way of the animal one more time, and pay what the animal charged. I found him at the Diamond Bar bunkhouse, and I told him fast, out of breath, my heart going like a young man's. A dozen men. Tonight. Del at the head, riding for her place. Cal Renner went still in a way I'd never seen, even from him. A stillness like the inside of a held breath. And then he did three things in order, and I watched him do them, and I understood I was watching a man make a choice he'd never be able to take back. He saddled his horse. He took down the rifle he kept wrapped in oilcloth in his war bag. A rifle I'd never once seen him carry to town, because Cal Renner had spent his whole life making sure no white man ever saw a brown man with a gun in his hands. He loaded it. His face while he did it was the saddest thing I have ever watched a young man's face do. And then he turned to me, and he said the thing that I have turned over in my mind every day since. "Eli," he said, "you go back to town. You weren't here. You don't ride out to that place tonight, you hear me. Whatever happens out there, you're an old man who was home asleep, and that's the truth you tell, and you tell it easy, because it's near enough to true to hold." He swung up into the saddle. "There's no version of this where I come back to Coldwater after tonight. I know that. I knew it on the boardwalk near enough. A man like me puts a gun between a mob and the thing they came for. There's no court in this territory'll call it anything but what they want to call it. So I'm not going to need this town any more after tonight, and you are. You go back. Let me carry it. I've got nobody it costs." That last was the lie, and we both knew it, and he said it kindly so I wouldn't have to argue. I've got nobody it costs. He had her. He'd had her for weeks, the something without a name they'd built passing stone to stone. And he was about to spend himself. His place in the only district that had ever given him work and let him be. His whole patient, quiet life of keeping his head down. To put his body between Cora Halloway and a dozen drunk, frightened men, knowing it would cost him everything and very likely his life. And he was doing it the way he'd done all of it. Without a word more than necessary, without letting anyone watch the price. I have spent the rest of my years trying to understand a thing like that. I don't think I have. I think some people are simply built with a thing in them that won't let them stand by, and that the thing is rare, and that the world mostly punishes it, and that they do it anyway, and that the doing of it is the closest thing to holy I have witnessed in a long and mostly unholy life. I didn't go back to town. That's the one thing I did right in the whole sorry business. I looked at Cal Renner telling me to save myself, and for the first time in maybe 20 years I declined to take the safe road that was being so kindly held open for me. I got back on my horse. My knees screamed. My heart was a hammer. I was an old man with no business in what was coming, and I went anyway, and I'll tell you the truth. I went partly out of decency, and partly because I could not stand the thought of living the rest of my life as the man who'd ridden the other way. There's vanity even in courage, but the act is the same either way, and I went. We rode south together in the dark, the young man and the old one, toward the wash and the half-built house of stone, and the dozen riders already somewhere ahead of us on the same road. Neither of us said much. There wasn't much. The night was hot and dead still, the kind of stillness that comes before the weather finally breaks. And away to the west the sky flickered now and again with lightning too far off to hear. The storm that hadn't come all summer, finally building, finally coming, too late to do anybody any good. I remember thinking that. Too late to do anybody any good. And I remember Cal looking at that far lightning too, and I remember he said the only thing he said the whole ride, half to himself, in a voice I had to lean to catch over the horses. "Rain settle the dust anyhow," he said. And then he touched his heels to his horse and went faster, toward whatever was waiting, and I went after him as fast as my old bones would allow, and the lightning walked closer along the western edge of the world, and somewhere ahead in the dark, a dozen men were nearly to the gate of a woman whose only crime was that she had fed a hungry child and refused to be made small. I had my own rifle across the saddle, an old man's rifle for coyotes. I had not fired it at a man in 30 years, and I did not know, riding through that hot black night with my heart trying to break my ribs, whether I had it in me to fire it at one now. We came up on the Halloway place from the east, off the road, through the broken ground, and we heard them before we saw them. You'd think a dozen men would make more noise. They didn't. That was the worst of it. There was no shouting, no whoop and holler the way you'd half expect from drunk men who'd ridden a long way to be cruel. There was just the low murmur of the animal, that many men breathing and shifting in the dark, horses stamping, the creak of leather, and under it Del Sutter's voice. Not loud, just steady, working the men the way you work a coal to keep it hot. They'd reined up in a loose half-circle at the edge of Cora's dooryard. Their horses' breath smoked in the lantern light. Somebody had brought a lantern, and somebody else a coil of rope, and a man does not bring a rope to scare a woman. A man brings a rope because somewhere in the back of the animal it has already been decided what the rope is for, and nobody will say it. And that is precisely how the worst things in this world get done, by men who have agreed not to say the thing they have agreed to do. And Cora Halloway was standing in her own doorway with her rifle up. Lord, but she was something. I've turned that picture over 1,000 times. One woman in the doorway of a half-built house she'd raised out of stone with her bared and bleeding hands, facing down 12 men in the dark, and her rifle was level and it did not waver. She knew what they were. She had to have known what the rope meant. And she stood there anyway, because the only thing she had left in the world was the refusal to be moved off the one piece of ground that was hers, and she had decided she would die on it before she'd run from it. I had thought, that first day on Front Street, that I'd seen everything stubbornness could be. I hadn't. Stubbornness, when it's the last thing a person owns, stops being a flaw and becomes the whole spine of them. "Now you put that down," Dell was saying in that reasonable, working the coal voice. "Nobody wants trouble. We just come to talk about our cattle. You put that rifle down and we'll talk like Christians." "You brought a rope to talk," Cora said. Her voice carried flat and clear across the dooryard. "I've known Christians, you're not them." I had my old rifle in my hands and my heart was a fist trying to beat its way out of me, and I did not know what to do. 12 men. 2 of us, 3 with her, and one of the 2 of us an old fool whose hands were shaking so bad he'd have been a danger to whichever side he aimed at. I have never in my life felt so useless and so afraid, and I have been afraid plenty. Cal Renner handed me his reins. He did it without a word, the way he did everything, and he stepped down off his horse there in the dark at the edge of the broken ground where they couldn't yet see him, and he checked his rifle one more time and he looked at me. The far lightning lit his face for half a second, blue-white, and I saw it was perfectly calm. Not brave calm, the kind men put on. Calm all the way down. Like a man who had already had every argument with himself, there was to have, and come out the other side of it into someplace quiet. "Stay back of the rocks," he said. "Whatever happens, you're a witness, Eli. That's your job tonight, not the rifle, the remembering. You see it true and you tell it true after because somebody's got to, and you're the only one out here who will." He almost smiled. "You write everything down anyhow." And then Cal Renner walked out of the dark into the lantern light, his rifle held low and easy across his body, not pointed at any man, and he put himself between the 12 riders and the woman in the doorway, and the night went so still you could hear the lantern flame breathing. It is a thing to watch a man do that, to walk, unhurried, into the open in front of a mob and stop and stand. I have seen brave things. I have seen men ride into a swollen river after stock and men hold a line in a fire. But I had never seen anything like Cal Renner walking out slow into that lantern light and turning to put his back to the rifle in the doorway and his face to the 12, choosing with his body which side of it he would die on. "Evening," he said. A ripple went through them. Somebody swore low. They knew him. Of course they knew him. The Diamond Bar greaser. The one who'd shamed Dell on the boardwalk. The one Dell had spent 3 weeks turning into the dark heart of everything wrong with their summer. "This ain't your business, Renner," Dell said, and there was a new thing in his voice now, a fear that had to keep moving or it would show. "You walk off. This is between us and her." "No," Cal said, "just that, no." "You'd die for her, a man like you." Dell's voice climbed. He was playing to the 12 now fast because he could feel something slipping. "You hear that, boys? He'll die for the squaw lover. Well, maybe that's fitting. Maybe." "I'm not dying for her," Cal said, and his quiet cut clean through Dell's climbing voice the way it had on the boardwalk, and the 12 went still to hear it. "I'm not even doing this for her, hardly. I'm doing it for me. I spent my whole life stepping off boardwalks so men like you wouldn't have to look at me, eating it, tipping my hat to men who spat at my mother. I told myself it was wisdom. It was just fear wearing a Sunday coat." He let that sit. "And I am done. You want to get to her, you come through me, and I'll take as many of you with me as this rifle holds, and the rest of you will spend the rest of your lives in a town that knows you needed 12 men and a rope to murder a widow and you still didn't get it clean. That's the night you're buying. That's the price. So." He shifted the rifle just slightly. "Who's first? Dell, you've done all the talking. You first." Nobody moved. That is the thing about the animal. It is brave only as long as it costs nothing. 12 men against one woman in the dark, that costs nothing, that's just appetite. But one man standing in front of them who has plainly stopped caring whether he lives, who has, you could see it, gone all the way past the place where a man can be frightened back. That changes the arithmetic, and every man in that half-circle was suddenly doing his own private sum and not liking it. Because Cal was right. The first man into him would die. Maybe two. And nobody, when it comes to it, wants to be the one who dies for Del Sutter's wounded pride. The animal had counted on Cora being alone. Alone, she was prey. With Cal in front of her willing, she was a thing that bit back, and the cost of the thing had just gone up past what most of them had come prepared to pay. I have thought since that it might have ended there. That the animal might have come apart, man by man finding his reason to be somewhere else, the way a mob will sometimes simply evaporate when the cost of it stands up and looks them in the eye. I have wanted, more than I can say, for it to have ended there. It didn't end there, the sky ended it. The storm that had been walking toward us all night, the rain 3 months too late, broke over the Mestino in one enormous shattering crack of thunder that came not as sound but as a blow, a thing you felt in your chest and teeth, and right on top of it the lightning hit. A draw not 200 yards off, white as the inside of the sun, close enough that the air smelled scorched. Every horse in that dooryard came undone at once. What happened then happened in the space of maybe 10 seconds, and I have spent years trying to lay it out straight, and I'm not sure I can. The horses bolted, bucked, spun. Men were thrown or hauled sideways fighting their mounts. Somebody's rifle went off. I don't know whose, I don't think anybody knew whose, I don't think it was aimed at anything. Just a man's hand clenching on a trigger as his horse came apart beneath him. And then it was a dozen guns, the way it goes. The first shot pulling the rest after it like a thread pulling a seam. Men firing at shadows and lightning ghosts and each other and nothing. The rain coming down now in a roar that ate the world. And Cal Renner. Cal Renner did not run for cover. He went the wrong way, toward the doorway, toward her. Because in that first instant of chaos a panicked horse had wheeled with a panicked man on its back, and the man's rifle had come up and around in the general direction of the doorway. And Cal saw it, and Cal moved, and he put himself in front of Cora Halloway one last time, his body between her and the swinging gun, and that is where the bullet found him. I will go to my grave believing he knew it would. That he did the same as everyone, and came out the other side, and walked into the answer with his eyes open. The rain came down like the end of the world. The horses scattered into the dark with their riders or without them. And it was over, the way these things end. Not in a decision, but in exhaustion and confusion, and men suddenly aware, in the lightning flashes, of what their hands had done, scrambling to be gone, to be anywhere but here, to be men who had been home asleep. I came out from the rocks. My knees gave on the way, and I went down in the mud and got up and kept on. The rain was so hard I could barely see. Cora was already down in the mud beside him with his head in her lap, and she had her hands pressed to the wound in his chest the same sure way I'd watched her hands work the dying mule that first day, low and certain, doing the thing that had to be done while there was still any reason to do it. There wasn't much. I knew it when I got to them, so did she. I think Cal did too. He was looking up at her through the rain. His lips were moving. I got down in the mud beside them. My old useless rifle dropped somewhere behind me, and I leaned close to hear. And what he was saying over and over, so quiet, was an apology. He was apologizing to her for not getting the wall done. They'd had a plan for the wall, the two of them, a plan to beat the law's 5-year clock, and the thing Cal Renner spent some of his last breath on was being sorry he wouldn't be there to finish it. Cora Halloway, who had not let this town see her weep once in all its weeks of trying to break her, put her forehead down against his in the pouring rain, and she wept then. She said something to him in Apache, low, the way she'd talked to the mule, the way she'd talked to the family at her door. And I don't know what it was, and I never asked, and I'm glad I don't know, because some words aren't meant for a third man's tally book. He heard it. I'll swear to that. Whatever it was, he heard it, and something in his face eased, and then a little while after that he was gone, with the rain washing the mud off his face as fast as it landed, and the storm that had come 3 months too late roaring down on all three of us like it meant to drown the whole sorry world and start it over. The town's story, of course, was different. By the time it had been chewed over in the saloon a few times, there'd been no mob at all. There'd been a dispute over stray cattle, and shots exchanged in the dark, and a regrettable accident in a thunderstorm, and the Renner fellow. Well, what was a man like that doing out there in the middle of the night anyhow, if not up to no good? 12 men went home and washed the rain and the mud off and agreed, without ever quite saying so, on the shape of the lie. And the lie held, because a town will protect its own story the way it protects nothing else. And there was no court in the territory that would take an old man's word and a widow's against 12. I tried. I want that written down. I rode to the county seat and I told a clerk and a deputy what I'd seen, true and plain, and they wrote some of it down and then they didn't do anything with what they'd written. And a man let me know kindly, the way Cal had told me things kindly, that an old foreman who still wanted to sell beef in this district might think about what stories he attached his name to. I came home. I am not proud of coming home. But Cal had made me a witness, not a martyr, and I told myself the difference mattered. Some days I believe it. Del Sutter died 3 winters later, drunk, of the cold, having found no large to feel any more now that the one man who'd ever made him feel small was in the ground. I felt nothing when I heard. I'd expected to feel something. The lack of it was its own quiet lesson about what hate does to the one who carries it longest. Cora Halloway stayed. That's the part I hold on to. They expected her to break and run after the way the town had been waiting for her to break and run since the day the mule went down on Front Street. She didn't. She buried Cal Renner up on the rise behind the house, in the ground he'd died on, and she finished the wall. Alone, the way she'd started it. It took her the better part of 2 years, and it near killed her, and she did it. I sent what help I could, the coward's quiet way, and then, after a time, not so quiet, because something in me had changed out there in the mud, and I found I cared a good deal less than I used to about what Coldwater thought of an old man. I'd ride out openly and lay up stone with her of an afternoon, the two of us not talking much, the way she and Cal hadn't talked much, and I'd like to think the wall has a few of my own stones in it down low, though my hands were never half as good as his. She proved up the claim. 5 years to the day, near enough, the half-section out past the Mestino wash that 2 men had died on, and a whole town had bet she couldn't hold, it came to her, free and clear, hers, with her name on the paper and no man's name beside it. I was there the day the pat came through. She read it standing in the doorway where Cal had died, and she didn't smile exactly and she didn't weep. She just looked out a long while at the country that had tried so hard to be rid of her and had failed. He wanted me to have it, she said. It was the only time she ever spoke of him to me directly. He didn't even know me 3 months, and he wanted me to have it more than he wanted to keep breathing. She folded the paper careful. I don't understand it. I've stopped trying to. I just mean to be worth it. I have thought about that more than almost anything anyone has ever said to me. I just mean to be worth it. As though a debt like that could be paid, ever, by anything but the living of a good, long, stubborn life on the ground he bought you with his body. Maybe it can. Maybe that's the only way such a debt ever gets paid. Not back, never back, just forward into the years. She's still out there, far as I know. I'm too old now to make the ride and find out for certain, and the not knowing is a thing I've made my peace with about as well as a man makes peace with anything he can't fix. The grass came back after that storm. The wash runs most summers now. There's a real house on that half-section, stone, with a wall around it that no weather has managed to take down, and a grave on the rise behind it that I'd wager she still tends, though I couldn't swear to it. I wrote it all down, finally. It took me longer than it should have. The hand isn't what it was, and the pencil keeps wanting to wander off, true. But it's down now, the way it happened, the way nobody in Coldwater will ever tell it. How a bold woman faced a whole town's mockery and outlasted every soul who laughed, and how one quiet man who'd spent his life stepping off boardwalks decided one evening that he wouldn't step off another, and what that cost, and what it bought. There's one thing I never settled, and I'll set it down here at the end because it's the thing that keeps me company on the nights I'd rather it didn't. A week after we put Cal in the ground, 3 riders came up the road to Cora's place at dusk. Apache. The same family I always believed, though I was a half-mile off and couldn't swear to it. They sat their horses at the edge of the dooryard, the way they had that first week, and Cora went out to them, and they talked a long while in the rain-gray light, and then the woman among them reached down and put something into Cora's hands. I never learned what. Cora carried it inside, and I never saw it after, and I never asked. But she stood in the doorway a long time after they'd gone, holding whatever it was against her chest, looking off down the dark road the way she'd looked at the territory the day her patent came through. I've wondered ever since what it was, and what they said, and what it meant that they'd come. Whether it was thanks or warning or something a white man like me has no word for at all. I never found out. There are things you don't get to know. There are deaths whose shape you only ever see the edge of. She went on inside after a while and shut the door against the dark, and the lamp came up gold in the window, and I turned my horse for home.